The night was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. Elijah, a young black boy of no more than 12, huddled in an alleyway, pulling a thin, tattered blanket tightly around his small frame. The blanket barely shielded him from the icy wind that howled through the narrow streets, whipping against the crumbling brick walls on either side of him. He clutched an old, faded backpack to his chest, the fabric worn and fraying at the edges. Inside was everything he owned: a few crumpled clothes, a photograph of his late mother, and a small, broken toy car that had once been his favorite. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left in the world. Elijah's stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten since the previous morning. He winced and curled up tighter, his knees drawn to his chest as he tried to ignore the gnawing hunger. The smell of discarded food from a nearby dumpster made his stomach churn, but he didn't move. The effort of standing, of hoping for scraps, felt too heavy to bear tonight. The city streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an oppressive silence. The occasional car rumbled by, its headlights cutting through the darkness for a fleeting moment before disappearing again. Above him, a flickering street lamp cast unsteady light onto the wet pavement, creating shifting shadows that danced across the alley walls. Elijah stared at the ground, his breath visible in the cold air as it came out in shallow, uneven puffs. His fingers, red and raw from the cold, clung to the edges of the blanket. A tear slid down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away, determined not to cry. Crying wouldn't change anything. It never did. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined warmth, a home, a bed, a meal. The image was fleeting, quickly overtaken by the harsh reality of the cold alleyway. But even in the depths of despair, a faint flicker of hope remained in Elijah's heart, though he didn't yet know it. This night, like so many others, felt endless. But what Elijah couldn't see was that his life was about to take a turn in ways he could never have imagined. Elijah shifted under his thin blanket, his body trembling from the cold. He tried to block out the sounds of the city, willing himself to sleep despite the ache in his stomach. As he adjusted his position, a faint sound reached his ears, soft and distant, barely audible over the wind. At first, he dismissed it as the cry of a stray cat, something he often heard in the alleys. But then it came again, louder this time. He sat up, his heart pounding. It wasn't a cat. It was a cry, a high-pitched, desperate wail that sent a chill down his spine. He glanced around the alley, searching for the source of the sound. The flickering street lamp above him cast eerie shadows, making everything feel even more unsettling. But the cry didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Driven by equal parts curiosity and concern, Elijah stood up, clutching his old backpack. His feet shuffled across the damp pavement as he followed the sound, each step filling him with a mixture of dread and determination. The cry led him to the end of the alley, where a large dumpster loomed under the faint glow of another street lamp. "Hello?" Elijah called out softly, his voice trembling. He approached the dumpster cautiously, his breath visible in the frigid air. The crying was coming from inside. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the edge of the dumpster. What if it was an animal? Or worse, what if it was a trap? His instincts told him to walk away, but the cries tugged at his heart. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, nestled among scraps of trash and old newspapers, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a dirty, tattered blanket. Elijah froze, his eyes widening in shock. The bundle moved slightly and the crying grew louder. He leaned closer, his hands trembling as he gently peeled back the edge of the blanket. His breath caught in his throat. It was a baby. "Oh my God!" Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. The baby's face was scrunched up, tears streaming down its cheeks as it wailed. Its tiny hands flailed weakly, the blanket doing little to shield it from the cold. Who "Who left you here?" Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. He stared at the baby, his mind racing. Who could abandon something so small, so helpless? The thought made his chest tighten with anger and sadness. The baby's cries grew softer as Elijah carefully reached into the dumpster. His hands trembled as he scooped up the bundle, cradling it close to his chest. The baby felt impossibly small and fragile in his arms. He held it awkwardly at first, unsure of what to do, but the warmth of its tiny body against his chest stirred something deep within him. "Don't worry," Elijah whispered, his voice soft and reassuring. "I'll keep you safe." He carried the baby back to his spot in the alley, his mind still reeling. Sitting down, he wrapped his own thin blanket around the both of them, pulling the baby close to shield it from the cold. The baby let out a few more weak cries before settling into soft whimpers, its tiny face relaxing slightly as it felt the warmth of Elijah's body. Elijah glanced at his backpack, biting his lip. Inside was a single piece of bread, the last bit of food he had. He pulled it out slowly, his stomach growling in protest. Tearing off a small piece, he crumbled it gently and offered it to the baby. The baby's mouth opened instinctively, its small lips working to eat the crumbs. "That's it," Elijah whispered, his voice full of encouragement. "You eat, okay? I don't have much, but it's yours." The baby's tiny hands gripped the edge of the blanket, and for a moment, Elijah smiled. He didn't know how he would manage, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to leave this baby alone. As the night wore on, Elijah rocked the baby gently, humming a tune his mother used to sing to him. The baby's cries stopped completely, its small chest rising and falling steadily as it drifted into sleep. Elijah's own exhaustion crept up on him, but he stayed awake, his arms cradling the baby protectively. The wind howled through the alley, but for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was caring for someone who needed him, someone even more vulnerable than he was. "I'll figure it out," Elijah whispered to the sleeping baby, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll keep you safe, no matter what." The flickering street lamp above them cast a soft glow over the alley as Elijah held the baby close, the two of them huddled together against the cold. Though the night was harsh, a small spark of hope burned within Elijah, a hope he hadn't felt in years. The pale morning light filtered into the alley as Elijah stirred awake, the sounds of the city waking up around him. He blinked groggily, the cold air biting at his skin. For a moment, he forgot where he was, until the soft whimper of the baby in his arms brought everything back. He looked down to see the tiny face peeking out from the tattered blanket. The baby stirred, letting out a faint cry. "Shh, it's okay," Elijah whispered, cradling the baby closer to his chest. He glanced around nervously, noticing people walking past the alley. Most didn't look his way, but a few threw quick, judgmental glances. His heart raced. What if someone tried to take the baby? Or worse, what if they accused him of stealing her? He adjusted the blanket around the baby and stood up, clutching his backpack in one hand and the baby in the other. His legs ached from the cold night, but he ignored it. The baby let out another soft cry, and Elijah knew he had to find food soon. He made his way through the bustling streets, avoiding eye contact with passers-by. The din of car horns and chatter was overwhelming, but Elijah kept his focus on the small diner up ahead. The smell of eggs and bacon wafted through the air, making his stomach ache with hunger. But this wasn't about him. He needed to find something for the baby. Stepping into the diner, Elijah felt the warmth of the space envelop him. The clinking of plates and the low hum of conversation filled the room. He hesitated near the door, unsure of what to do. A waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and an apron stained from the morning rush, spotted him. Her gaze immediately went to the baby in his arms. She approached him, her expression guarded. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious as her eyes scanned him from head to toe. "Please," Elijah said, his voice trembling. "I found her last night in an alley. She's hungry. Do you have anything she can eat?" The waitress frowned, crossing her arms. Her gaze lingered on Elijah's worn clothes and unkempt appearance. She raised an eyebrow, her voice skeptical. "Where'd you get that baby?" Elijah's grip on the baby tightened, his heart pounding. He could feel the eyes of a few patrons on him, their murmurs just loud enough to catch. "I'm telling the truth," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "I found her in the alley last night. She was all alone. Please, she needs food." For a moment, the waitress said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, she glanced down at the baby, whose faint cries tugged at something in her heart. Her posture softened slightly, and she let out a small sigh. "Wait here," she said, turning toward the kitchen. Elijah stood awkwardly by the door, avoiding the curious stares of the other patrons. He shifted the baby in his arms, rocking her gently to keep her calm. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned with a bottle of milk and a small plate of scrambled eggs. "Here," she said, handing them to Elijah. "It's on the house. Just make sure you're telling the truth, okay?" Elijah's eyes widened in gratitude as he took the bottle and food. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I swear, I'm not lying. I didn't know where else to go." The waitress nodded, her expression softening further. She crouched slightly to look at the baby, her voice gentle. "Poor thing," she murmured. "What kind of person leaves a baby out in the cold?" Elijah didn't answer. He sat at an empty booth near the corner, placing the baby on the seat beside him. Carefully, he fed her the milk, watching as her tiny hands clutched at the bottle. Her cries quieted, replaced by soft, contented noises as she drank. Elijah couldn't help but smile, relief washing over him. As he ate the eggs in small bites, savoring each one, he noticed a few patrons still watching him. Some whispered to each other, their expressions skeptical or disapproving. But no one said anything to him directly. The waitress occasionally glanced his way, her face unreadable, but she didn't approach again. When the baby finished the milk, she drifted back to sleep in his arms. Elijah sat there for a moment, staring at the empty plate in front of him. The warmth of the diner and the kindness of the waitress had given him a moment of reprieve, but he knew it wouldn't last. He couldn't stay there forever. As he stood to leave, the waitress approached him again, pressing a small package into his free hand. Inside was another bottle of milk and a sandwich wrapped in paper. "For later," she said quietly. "Take care of her." Elijah nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He stepped out into the cold again, the baby bundled securely in his arms. The city felt just as harsh as before, but Elijah's heart felt a little lighter. Someone had helped him today. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. It gave him hope, however small, that he could keep going, that he could protect her. Elijah sat on the cold concrete outside the diner, the baby cradled carefully in his lap. He held the bottle of milk the waitress had given him, feeding the baby while murmuring soft reassurances. The warmth of the milk seemed to calm the tiny child, and Elijah felt a small spark of pride that he'd managed to keep her safe for another moment. Around him, the city buzzed with life, cars honking, footsteps hurrying past, and the occasional chatter of passers-by. But none of it mattered. His focus was entirely on the fragile life in his arms. As he sat there, a sleek black luxury car pulled up to the curb nearby. Its polished surface gleamed under the pale morning sunlight. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as he scanned the street. His presence was commanding, the kind that made people take notice. As he locked the car and began walking toward the diner, his eyes fell on Elijah. The sight of a young boy, disheveled and shivering, cradling a baby on the sidewalk, was so unexpected that Mr. Carter paused mid-step, He tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. After a moment, he approached cautiously, his leather shoes clicking softly on the pavement. "Excuse me," Mr. Carter said, his deep voice polite but firm. Elijah looked up, startled by the sudden attention. His grip on the baby tightened instinctively. "Yes, sir?" Elijah replied, his voice small but steady. Mr. Carter crouched slightly, his sharp eyes studying Elijah and the baby carefully. His gaze wasn't judgmental, just inquisitive. "Is that your sister?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. Elijah hesitated for a moment, unsure of how the man would react to the truth, but he'd learned that honesty often worked better than lying. Lowering his gaze, he shook his head. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I found her last night in an alley. She was all alone. I didn't know what else to do." Mr. Carter's brow furrowed as he straightened his posture slightly. His expression softened, a mix of concern and curiosity crossing his face. "You found her? And you've been taking care of her since then?" Elijah nodded, adjusting the blanket around the baby as she stirred slightly. He didn't say anything more, but the exhaustion and determination in his young face spoke volumes. For a moment, Mr. Carter said nothing, his gaze lingering on the boy and the infant. Then, slowly, he knelt down to be at eye level with Elijah. "That's a big responsibility," Mr. Carter said, his tone gentler now. "Not many people your age would have done what you did. Why didn't you go to the police or someone else?" Elijah glanced away, his grip on the baby tightening. His voice was hesitant as he replied, "I was scared they'd take her away. Or think I did something wrong. I didn't want her to be alone again." Mr. Carter's expression softened further, his heart tugged by the boy's honesty and compassion. He could see the fear and determination in Elijah's eyes, the kind of resolve that came from having lived a life far harder than any child should. After a moment, he smiled faintly. "You've got a good heart, kid," he said. "But you can't do this alone." Elijah looked back at him, uncertain. The kindness in Mr. Carter's voice was genuine, but years of living on the streets had taught Elijah to be wary of trusting strangers. "What do you mean, sir?" Elijah asked cautiously. Mr. Carter shifted slightly, glancing at the baby before speaking. "I mean, let me help you. I can make sure the baby gets the care she needs, and you too. You don't have to do this by yourself." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope mingling with his hesitation. He studied Mr. Carter's face, searching for any sign of dishonesty or ulterior motives, but all he saw was sincerity. "Why would you want to help us?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter's smile grew a little warmer. He sat back on his heels, clasping his hands in front of him. "Because sometimes life puts us in a position to make a difference," he said simply. "And when that happens, the only right thing to do is to act. You've already done so much for this little one. Let me take it from here. We can find her a safe place, and make sure you're taken care of too." Elijah hesitated, his mind racing. Could he trust this man? What if he was wrong? But the weight of the past day, the fear, the hunger, the overwhelming responsibility, pressed down on him. Slowly, he nodded, his voice quiet, but resolute. "Okay, but promise me she'll be safe." Mr. Carter nodded firmly, his expression serious. "I promise," he said. With that, Mr. Carter extended a hand, helping Elijah to his feet. The baby let out a soft whimper, and Elijah instinctively cradled her closer. Together, they walked toward the luxury car, the morning light casting long shadows on the pavement. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elijah allowed himself to hope that things might finally get better. As Elijah climbed into the warmth of Mr. Carter's luxury car, the baby nestled securely in his arms. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the past day slowly lifting. The leather seats were soft, a stark contrast to the cold pavement he'd slept on the night before. Mr. Carter started the car, but before driving off, he turned to Elijah, his expression kind but serious. "Before we do anything else, I need to make sure this little one is safe," Mr. Carter said, gesturing to the baby. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Elijah tensed, worried about what might happen next, but Mr. Carter's reassuring tone calmed him. "I'm calling social services," Mr. Carter explained. "They'll make sure she's cared for properly. You did an amazing job keeping her safe, but this is something they're equipped to handle." Elijah nodded reluctantly, his grip on the baby tightening slightly. Mr. Carter noticed and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've done more for her than most people would, Elijah. You have nothing to feel bad about," he said softly. After explaining the situation to the authorities, Mr. Carter hung up and turned his attention fully to Elijah. His expression was warm, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Elijah," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I need you to know that what you did for that baby, it says a lot about who you are. You didn't have much, but you still chose to help someone else. That kind of selflessness is rare." Elijah looked down at his lap, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised or noticed, let alone for something good. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "I just didn't want her to be alone," he said. "I know what that feels like." Mr. Carter nodded, his expression softening even further. "I know what that feels like too," he said. "I lost my wife and child a few years ago in an accident. Since then, I've been looking for a way to honor their memory, to help someone who needs it." Elijah's eyes widened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of pain in Mr. Carter's usually composed demeanor. The man took a deep breath before continuing. "When I saw you sitting there, holding that baby, I knew I had to help. Not just the baby, but you too, because someone with a heart like yours deserves a chance." Elijah stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, as if he were worth something. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Mr. Carter smiled gently and placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder again. "Here's what I want to do," he said. "I have an extra room at my house. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and it's safe. You can stay there for as long as you need. I'll make sure you have clothes, food, and anything else you need to get back on your feet." Elijah blinked, his heart racing. The offer sounded too good to be true. He hesitated, his voice trembling as he asked, "Why would you do that?" "You don't even know me." Mr. Carter's smile didn't waver. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply, "and I know that sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you to change your life." For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt tears welling up in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away, nodding silently. The baby let out a soft coo, as if sensing the moment, and both Elijah and Mr. Carter chuckled softly. The car ride to Mr. Carter's home was quiet, but filled with an unspoken understanding. When they arrived, Elijah was awestruck by the house. A warm, welcoming place with a garden and lights glowing softly in the windows. Mr. Carter led him inside, showing him the room that would be his. It was simple but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a soft blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "This is yours now," Mr. Carter said, his voice gentle. "Take your time getting settled. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps. For now, just rest." Elijah stood in the doorway, his backpack still slung over his shoulder. He looked around the room, then back at Mr. Carter, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said. Mr. Carter smiled and nodded, leaving Elijah to settle in. That night, as Elijah lay in the warm bed, staring up at the ceiling, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, things could get better, and it was all because someone had seen the goodness in him and decided to give him a chance. The warm glow of the morning sun filtered through the windows of the cozy house, casting light onto the living room where Elijah sat at the dining table, carefully finishing his homework. The past week felt like a whirlwind. One moment, he was shivering in a cold alley, and the next, he had a warm bed, fresh clothes, and food whenever he needed it. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so secure. In the corner of the room, Mr. Carter sat with a cup of coffee, glancing over some papers. His presence was calm yet reassuring, a steady figure that had quickly become a mentor and father figure to Elijah. The two had grown close in a short time, spending evenings talking about life, goals, and possibilities that Elijah had never dared to dream of before. "How's the math coming along?" Mr. Carter asked, looking up from his papers with a small smile. Elijah grinned sheepishly, scratching the back of his head. "It's getting there," he replied. "Still not my favorite subject, though." "Well, keep at it," Mr. Carter said with a chuckle. "You're a smart kid, Elijah. You can handle it." Elijah's grin widened. Hearing those words meant more to him than he could express. For so long, he had felt invisible, dismissed, and unworthy. But now someone believed in him, and it made all the difference. The baby, whom Elijah had named Hope during their short time together, had been placed with a loving foster family earlier in the week. It was bittersweet for Elijah, but knowing she was safe and cared for filled him with peace. Mr. Carter had promised to help him stay updated on her well-being, a gesture that further cemented their bond. "You ready for your first day?" Mr. Carter asked, nodding toward the new backpack resting by the door. It was filled with fresh notebooks, pencils, and everything Elijah would need for school, things that had once seemed impossible for him to have. Elijah nodded, his excitement tempered by a hint of nervousness. "Yeah, it's been a while, though," he admitted, adjusting the straps on his shirt. "You'll do great," Mr. Carter reassured him. "Just be yourself, and remember, this is a fresh start. You've got everything you need to succeed now." As they headed out the door, Elijah grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. The crisp morning air greeted them as they stepped onto the porch. Mr. Carter walked with Elijah to the car, his steady presence giving the boy an extra boost of confidence. When they arrived at the school, Elijah's heart raced as he stepped out of the car. The sight of the bustling campus, filled with students chatting and laughing, felt intimidating at first. But then, he remembered everything that had led him here. The baby he had saved, the kindness of a stranger who had become family, and the second chance he had been given. "Go on," Mr. Carter said, giving him an encouraging pat on the back. "I'll be here to pick you up after school. You've got this." Elijah nodded, his grip tightening on the straps of his backpack as he turned toward the school building. With each step, the nervousness faded, replaced by a growing sense of determination. He wasn't the same scared, hungry boy he had been a week ago. He was stronger now, braver, and full of hope. As he walked through the school gates, some of the other students glanced his way, but this time, Elijah didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel out of place. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged.